The first words my father said to me at my grandfather's funeral were, "Still playing doctor in the army?" He said it loud enough for the men standing around him to hear. That part mattered to him. Not me, them. 3 defense contractors in dark suits stood beside him, holding crystal glasses of bourbon like it was a networking event instead of a funeral reception. One of them gave me an awkward half-smile. The other 2 looked away. I stood there in my army dress uniform, feeling suddenly aware of every hour I'd spent wearing it. The fabric was clean and pressed, but the cuffs were worn softer than they used to be. 10 years of hospitals, deployments, overnight flights, and too many ceremonies. My father glanced down at the ribbons on my chest. "Well," he said with a little shrug, "I guess somebody has to hand out Band-Aids." Daniel laughed immediately. Of course he did. My younger brother had always laughed half a second too hard at our father's jokes. I should have turned around right then. Honestly, I almost did. I'd spent the entire drive from Bethesda telling myself this trip was about my grandfather, not the rest of them. But standing inside that reception hall at the Army-Navy Country Club in Arlington, hearing my father's voice again after nearly 10 years, I felt 16 all over again. Too loud, too emotional, never enough. My stepmother, Linda, walked past me carrying a plate of shrimp cocktail without even making eye contact. That was impressive, honestly. Ignoring somebody in a crowded room takes practice. Outside the tall windows behind them, the February sky hung gray over Arlington National Cemetery. A cold drizzle had started during the burial service and never fully stopped. You could still smell wet wool coats and damp grass every time the door opened. General Raymond Carter had been buried less than an hour earlier with full military honors. 21-gun salute, folded flag, bugler playing taps. My grandfather had spent 42 years in the Army. Korea first, then Vietnam, then decades inside the Pentagon after that. By the time he retired, people spoke about him carefully, like saying his name too casually might somehow disrespect the building itself. And still, somehow, his funeral felt more political than personal. Senators wandered around shaking hands. Retired generals stood near the bar, talking quietly. Half the room seemed more interested in who showed up than who'd died. That part probably would have disgusted my grandfather if he'd been alive to see it. Daniel came over, holding a whiskey glass. "Hey, Evie," he said. "Didn't know Army doctors got this much time off." I looked at him for a second. He'd gained weight since I'd last seen him. Expensive haircut, red around the eyes, the kind of puffiness bourbon eventually gives rich men who think golf counts as exercise. "You look tired," I said. His smile tightened instantly. Small victories. "I'm doing great," he said. "Dad brought me into the company 3 years ago." "Good for you." "You know, we just landed another Pentagon supply contract." I almost laughed at the irony of that sentence, though I didn't know the full irony yet. Instead, I picked up a glass of club soda from a passing tray, because I'd learned years ago not to drink around my family. Daniel leaned closer. "So what are you now, Lieutenant Captain?" "Colonel." That shut him up for maybe 2 whole seconds. Then he snorted. "In the medical corps." There it was, always the qualifier. Not real Army, not real success, not real leadership. Just Evelyn playing pretend while the important people ran the world. I was about to answer when the room suddenly shifted. You know how sometimes a crowded place changes energy before you even know why? Conversations softened. A few people straightened instinctively. Then I heard the sharp sound of dress shoes stopping against hardwood floors behind me. I turned. Thomas Whitaker stood near the entrance with 3 federal security agents a few feet behind him. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Tall, gray-haired, calm in the way powerful people sometimes are when they no longer need to prove anything. I recognized him immediately from briefings and military medical conferences, though we'd only spoken a handful of times over the years. My father noticed him too, and suddenly Richard Carter looked very interested in fixing his jacket cuffs. Whitaker scanned the room once before his eyes landed on me. Then he walked straight over, not toward my father, toward me. The room got quieter with every step. When he stopped in front of me, he gave a small nod first. Then he saluted. Not casually either. Formal, precise, the kind you feel in your chest. I returned it automatically before my brain even caught up. "Colonel Carter," he said, "good to see you again." "Sir." One of the senators near the bar actually turned fully around to stare at us. Whitaker lowered his voice slightly. "The men you saved in Kandahar still ask about you." For a second, nobody around us moved. Not Daniel, not my father, not the room full of people who'd spent the last hour acting like I was some embarrassing family detour. Whitaker extended his hand. "It's an honor to finally pay my respects to your grandfather in person," he said. "He spoke about you often near the end." That part hit harder than I expected, because my grandfather and I barely spoke the last decade. Birthday cards sometimes, Christmas texts through assistants, one awkward phone call after my promotion to colonel. That was about it. I shook Whitaker's hand carefully. "Thank you, sir." Behind him, one of the security agents stepped aside to let a waitress pass. The movement snapped the room back to life. Conversation slowly restarted, though quieter now, different. People were looking at me differently. My father especially. He stared at the rows of ribbons on my chest like he was seeing them for the first time. Maybe he was. Whitaker glanced toward the large black and white portrait of my grandfather near the fireplace. "He was proud of you," he said simply. Then he moved on to greet other guests. And just like that, I was standing alone again, holding a sweating glass of club soda while my entire family tried to recalculate who they thought I was. Funny thing is, I didn't actually feel victorious. Mostly, I felt tired, because people think revenge feels loud when it finally happens. Usually, it's quiet. Usually, it's standing in a crowded room, realizing the people who underestimated you were working off a version of you that stopped existing years ago. I walked over toward the hallway near the coat room, mostly to breathe for a minute. That's where I heard my father behind me. "Evelyn." I turned slowly. For the first time all afternoon, he didn't sound amused. He sounded unsettled. "How exactly do you know Thomas Whitaker?" I looked at him for a second, then I said the truth. "The same way most people do in war, Dad." I adjusted my gloves. "You meet them on somebody's worst day." I didn't answer my father after that. I just walked past him and stepped outside into the cold air. The rain had mostly stopped, but the pavement outside the reception hall still glistened under the parking lot lights. Somewhere farther down the hill, another funeral detail was folding a flag. You could hear the muffled commands drifting through the trees. I loosened my collar slightly and took a breath. That should have felt satisfying, watching my father stand there speechless for once. Instead, all I felt was exhausted. Thomas Whitaker came outside about a minute later, carrying 2 paper coffee cups. He handed me one without asking. Black. Military people always assume black coffee unless told otherwise. "Thanks," I said. "You look surprised to see me." I was surprised to see the salute. That made him smile a little. Well, he said you earned it. We stood there quietly for a few seconds, watching headlights move through the cemetery roads below us. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. Your grandfather asked about you more than once before he passed. I looked over at him. Whitaker reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old silver Zippo lighter, scratched, dented near one corner. I recognized it immediately. My grandfather used to carry that lighter everywhere, even after he quit smoking. He wanted you to have this, Whitaker said. For a second, I just stared at it in his hand. That stupid lighter hit me harder than the funeral had, because objects don't lie the way people do. If my grandfather carried that thing for 50 years and chose to leave it to me, then somewhere along the line, I mattered to him more than I thought. I don't understand, I admitted quietly. Whitaker nodded once, like he expected that answer. Most men from his generation weren't very good at saying things directly. No, I said. They really weren't. He gave me a long look then. You remind me of him, actually. That almost made me laugh. My grandfather barely spoke to me the last decade. Doesn't mean he wasn't watching. Whitaker left a few minutes later after another brief handshake, and I stayed outside alone with that lighter in my hand, while memories I hadn't thought about in years started creeping back in. Funny how grief works. Sometimes it's not the funeral that gets you. It's standing in the dark, holding something familiar. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in a family where appearances mattered almost as much as oxygen. My father loved introducing us at events. This is my son Daniel. Then, and this is my daughter Evelyn. She's very bright. Very bright. Like I was a student science project instead of a person, the Carter family. Believed in legacy the way some families believe in religion. Politics, military influence, money, reputation, everything was about positioning. Who you married, who you knew, which room you walked into. My father always assumed I'd go into law or politics eventually. Something respectable, something visible, preferably something in Washington where he could use my success like another business card. But somewhere around college, I realized I didn't actually care about any of that. I cared about medicine, real medicine, not donor dinners and campaign speeches about veterans while somebody else cleaned up the damage afterward. I still remember the night I told my family I was accepting the Army's HPSP scholarship instead of going the traditional route through Johns Hopkins. We were eating dinner at my father's house in McLean. Steaks, crystal glasses, one of those huge dining tables nobody actually relaxes around. Daniel laughed first. Wait, he said you actually want to join the Army? I want to be a trauma surgeon. In the Army, my father corrected, like it was a contamination. I explained the scholarship, medical school covered, in exchange for service years afterward. My father set his fork down carefully. That's not what this family does. I still remember how calm his voice sounded. Honestly, that was always worse than yelling. I'm not asking permission, I told him. Big mistake. The silence afterward stretched so long, even Linda stopped eating. Finally, my father leaned back in his chair. You're throwing away opportunities people would kill for. No, I said. I'm choosing my own. He looked at me differently after that, like something had broken loose from where it belonged. Within a week, he cut me off financially. No trust fund access, no family support, nothing. I took out additional loans and started working like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. Medical residency was brutal in ways civilians sometimes romanticize without understanding. There's nothing glamorous about being so tired your hands shake while you're trying to calculate medication dosages at 3 a.m. Nothing noble about crying in a hospital stairwell because you haven't slept more than 4 hours in 2 days. I got married during residency, too. Tom, Dallas police officer, funny, kind, patient at first. We lasted almost 3 years. Army medicine and marriage don't always survive each other, especially once deployments start. I remember exactly when I knew my marriage was ending. I was in Texas for barely 48 hours between training rotations, still half jet-lagged. We got into an argument because I fell asleep sitting upright at the kitchen table. Tom finally looked at me and said, "I don't even think you live here anymore." I wanted to fight back. Instead, I realized he was right. The actual divorce conversation happened later, over a 3-minute phone call while I was stationed overseas. 3 minutes. That's all it took to legally dismantle a life. After the call ended, I took my wedding ring off inside a supply closet beside the surgical unit and slipped it into my scrub pocket. Then, I scrubbed in for another surgery 15 minutes later. That's military medicine. Life keeps moving, whether you're emotionally ready or not. Afghanistan changed me permanently, though, not in the dramatic movie way people imagine. It was smaller than that, quieter. The smell of dust mixed with bleach inside medical tents, helicopters at night, energy drinks and burnt coffee keeping everybody alive. 19-year-old kids trying not to scream while medics cut uniforms off their bodies. And the exhaustion. God, the exhaustion. There was one week near Kandahar where I think I slept maybe 9 total hours. Then came the mass casualty attack. Insurgents hit a convoy outside the base perimeter, multiple injuries, burn trauma, shrapnel wounds, blood everywhere. The evacuation alarm sounded halfway through intake because intelligence warned about a possible secondary attack. Some personnel started pulling back. We stayed. You don't leave patients open on operating tables if you can still help them, not if you're worth a damn. I barely remember most of that night clearly anymore. Trauma does that sometimes. But I remember one young private grabbing my sleeve, asking me not to let him die before his mother got there. And I remember another patient, civilian male, early 20s, severe abdominal injuries, security personnel everywhere around him. At one point, somebody quietly informed me he was connected to a senior Defense Department official. I honestly didn't care. Inside trauma bays, everybody bleeds the same. We kept him alive anyway. Near dawn, after almost 14 straight hours operating, I finally sat down against a supply crate outside the surgical tent. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. One of the nurses handed me stale coffee in a paper cup, and for maybe 30 seconds, I just stared at the sunrise over the dust, thinking, if my family could see me right now, they still wouldn't understand why I chose this life. By the time we got back to my grandfather's house in McLean, it was already dark outside. The rain had finally stopped, but everything still looked wet and cold under the streetlights. Black SUVs lined both sides of the driveway. Valets moved quietly between them, while people in expensive coats stood around talking in low political voices. Same city, same game. The Carter house sat on almost 2 acres, tucked behind stone gates and perfectly trimmed hedges. My grandfather bought it sometime in the late 70s, back when powerful men in Washington still preferred old brick homes over giant glass mansions. I hadn't been inside in nearly 11 years, not since Christmas before Afghanistan. Walking through those front doors again felt strange, familiar and foreign at the same time. The house smelled exactly the same, though. Leather furniture, wood polish, cigars that nobody officially smoked indoors. Memories funny like that. Sometimes scent hits harder than photographs. Staff from a catering company moved trays of food around the dining room, while guests drifted between conversations. Retired officers stood near the fireplace, discussing defense budgets. Somebody laughed too loudly in the kitchen. Meanwhile, my grandfather's portrait sat alone near the staircase. That part bothered me more than I expected. People always claim funerals are about honoring the dead, but half the time they're really about managing the living. I took off my dress jacket and folded it carefully over my arm. Almost immediately, an older Marine general approached me. Silver hair, deep voice, walking cane. "Colonel Carter?" "Yes, sir." He shook my hand firmly. "My grandson served under the evacuation team you worked with in Kandahar." "Oh." "He made it home because of people like you." I never know what to say to things like that. You learn pretty quickly in military medicine that survival is never one person's accomplishment. There are too many hands involved. Still, I nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." As he walked away, I noticed Daniel watching from across the room, holding what looked like his fourth bourbon of the night. He already had that glossy-eyed look rich men get when alcohol and resentment start mixing together. "Quite the celebrity now, huh?" he said when I walked near the dining room. "Relax, Daniel." "No, seriously," he said. "This is incredible. You disappear for 10 years, and suddenly everybody acts like you stormed Normandy." I sighed. "You're drunk." "And you're sanctimonious." "There it is." He stepped closer. "You know what your problem is?" he asked quietly. "You walk around acting morally superior because you wore camouflage." I wore scrubs most of the time, actually. That irritated him more. Little brother syndrome doesn't magically disappear at 40. Before he could answer, the family attorney entered the room carrying a leather folder. And just like that, conversation stopped. Everybody knew what time it was. The reading of the will happened in my grandfather's study, same room where he used to sit smoking cigars while watching military history documentaries with the volume too loud. The shelves still held old war biographies and framed photos with presidents going back 40 years. I stood near the back wall while Richard sat confidently beside the attorney, like a man already expecting ownership. Daniel slumped into a leather chair, nursing fresh bourbon. Linda sat quietly with crossed legs, pretending not to look nervous. The attorney adjusted his glasses, then he began. Most of the early portions were predictable. Donations to military charities, money distributed among extended family, property holdings. Then came the house. Richard inherited it. No surprise there. Honestly, I barely listened at first. I expected nothing. Maybe my grandfather's watch, if I was lucky. Then the attorney paused. "And to my granddaughter, Colonel Evelyn Carter." The room shifted slightly. I looked up. "I leave my personal military journal, service medals, and controlling leadership authority over the Carter Foundation for Wounded Service Members." Daniel blinked. My father's expression hardened instantly. I think that was the moment he realized something unexpected was happening. The attorney continued. "There is also a sealed personal letter to be delivered privately." He handed me an envelope, my name written in my grandfather's handwriting. Just seeing that nearly cracked something open inside me. I didn't read it immediately. Richard stood first. "This is ridiculous." The attorney remained calm. General Carter was very clear in his instructions. The foundation belongs with the family business. "No," the attorney said carefully. "It belongs where General Carter decided." That shut the room down fast. My father hated being corrected publicly, especially by employees. I quietly stepped out of the study with the letter still unopened in my hand. Nobody stopped me, not even Daniel. I ended up alone in the downstairs den near the old wet bar my grandfather used during Army football games. For a minute, I just stared at the envelope, then finally opened it. The letter wasn't long. That somehow made it worse. "Your father mistakes silence for strength. I made the same mistake for too many years. I should have told you long ago that I followed your career closely. You became exactly the kind of officer this family used to admire before money replaced character." I felt my throat tighten reading that. Then came the part that changed everything. Several years ago, I learned Richard's company knowingly approved defective battlefield medical equipment for distribution contracts. I cooperated with investigators quietly before my death. If you are reading this, I no longer have to protect anyone from the truth. I stopped breathing for a second. Defective medical equipment. At first, my brain resisted it completely. Then suddenly, memories started connecting themselves fast. Too fast. A trauma bay in Kandahar, bright lights overhead, blood everywhere. 19-year-old private on the operating table, bleeding through shredded combat fatigues. I remembered reaching for a tourniquet from a trauma kit during surgery. I remembered tightening it, then feeling the locking mechanism snap loose in my hands. At the time, we blamed manufacturing defects under battlefield stress, random failure, bad luck. The kid died 43 minutes later. I still remembered his first name, Tyler. Jesus Christ. I sat down slowly on the edge of the leather couch because my knees suddenly didn't feel reliable anymore. My father's company supplied trauma equipment to military contracts. Not all of them, but enough. Enough for me to start understanding. The room suddenly felt too warm, too small. There's a particular kind of nausea that comes when grief and rage hit at the same time. Not explosive rage, worse. Cold rage. The kind that settles into your bones quietly. A knock sounded lightly against the open doorway. I looked up. Thomas Whitaker stood there. "I figured you'd read it eventually," he said softly. "You knew?" "I knew your grandfather was cooperating with defense investigators." My jaw tightened. "How bad is it?" Whitaker didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. He stepped farther inside the room. "Your grandfather loved your father," he said. "But near the end, I think he realized protecting him had cost him too much already." I laughed once without humor. "That makes two of us." Whitaker's expression shifted slightly then. Not pity exactly. Recognition, maybe. "You know," he said quietly, "most people in this town spend their lives trying to become important." He nodded toward the letter in my hands. "Your grandfather died trying to become decent again." After he left, I sat there alone for a long time, listening to muffled conversations upstairs, while one horrible thought kept repeating itself in my head. All those years overseas, all those surgeries, all those boys we tried to save, and somewhere inside some of those medical kits was my family's name. I stayed in that downstairs den until I heard raised voices upstairs. Not shouting yet, just sharper tones cutting through the polite funeral atmosphere. Washington people have a talent for arguing quietly. They can threaten your entire future while sounding like they're discussing golf scores. I folded my grandfather's letter carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of my uniform jacket. My hands still felt cold. Not shaky anymore, just cold. When I walked back upstairs, the reception had shifted into something uglier. You could feel it immediately. The room had divided itself without anyone announcing it. Clusters of people stood farther apart now. Conversations lowered when my father walked by. A retired Air Force general near the fireplace suddenly found the ice in his drink very interesting the second Richard approached him. Nobody likes standing too close to smoke once they smell something burning. Daniel was at the bar again. 5th bourbon, maybe? 6th. Hard to tell. Linda sat rigidly on a couch, pretending none of this was happening, while absently twisting her wedding ring around her finger. My father spotted me entering the room and immediately straightened. There it was, the politician posture. Controlled shoulders, calm face, smile that never reached the eyes. "Evelyn," he said, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "There you are." I didn't answer. He walked toward me, holding a fresh drink. "You disappeared during your own grandfather's reception now?" I needed air. "No," he said, quietly. "You needed drama." A couple standing nearby pretended not to listen. They listened anyway. My father lowered his voice slightly. "I don't know what game you think you're playing tonight. I'm not playing anything. Thomas Whitaker shows up suddenly. Everybody's treating you like some kind of war hero. I never asked them to." That irritated him more because it was true. My father had spent his whole life chasing important people, networking dinners, campaign donations, defense contracts, golf weekends in Virginia with senators. Meanwhile, respect had followed me into the room wearing combat boots and carrying surgical scars. That difference was eating him alive. Daniel wandered over, holding another drink. "Well," he announced loudly, "looks like Evie finally found people impressed by her little army hobby." A few guests glanced over uncomfortably. I was too tired for this. Honestly, deeply tired. Not just physically, soul tired. I looked at my brother carefully. "You should slow down." "Or what?" "Or tomorrow's gonna hurt." Daniel laughed hard enough to spill bourbon onto his own sleeve. "God," he said, "you always do this." "Do what?" "Talk like you're wiser than everybody else because you spent time overseas." "No," I said quietly. "I talk like somebody who's seen things you haven't." That landed. His face tightened immediately, because underneath the jokes and drinking and arrogance, Daniel had always known one thing. He'd never actually done anything hard. My father stepped between us smoothly. "Enough." Then he smiled at nearby guests like this was all harmless family banter. Classic Richard Carter move. Contain the optics first. A catering server passed, carrying trays of crab cakes while tension spread through the room like static electricity. I should have left then. I really should have. I even picked up my coat from the chair near the hallway. But right before I reached the door, I heard my father speaking again behind me, loud enough for the room. "My daughter always preferred playing soldier over building a real life." That stopped me, not because it hurt, because suddenly I realized he still truly believed that. After everything, after the funerals, after the surgeries, after all the years, he still thought service was pretend and money was real. I turned slowly. The room had gone almost completely silent. My father took another sip of bourbon. You spent 10 years patching people up in deserts while adults built this country. Nobody moved. Even Daniel looked nervous now. I walked back toward him carefully and set my coat down. You really want to do this here? My father gave a little shrug. Why not? Apparently, I'm already the villain tonight. I looked around the room. Retired military officers, Pentagon staff, political donors, widows, veterans, people who actually understood what war costs. Then I looked back at my father, and something inside me finally settled. No anger anymore, just clarity. You know what I remember most from Kandahar? I asked quietly. Richard rolled his eyes slightly. Here we go, that expression said. I ignored it. I remember a 19-year-old private named Tyler Mercer. The room stayed silent. He came into surgery after an IED strike outside the perimeter road. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I continued. He was conscious when they brought him in, kept apologizing for screaming because he thought he sounded weak. A retired Marine near the fireplace lowered his eyes. I could hear ice clinking softly somewhere behind me. We almost stabilized him, I said. Almost. My father's expression hardened. Evelyn, this isn't the place. No, I interrupted calmly. Tonight's exactly the place. That surprised him. I usually avoided confrontation growing up. Daniel started to say something, but one look from me shut him down. I kept going. We used a fresh trauma kit during surgery, brand new supplies shipped through military procurement contracts. My father's jaw tightened, almost invisibly. And there it was, recognition, tiny but real. The tourniquet failed while we were trying to stop the bleeding, I said. The locking mechanism snapped. Nobody in the room moved now. I remember thinking some factory worker somewhere probably made a mistake. I looked directly at my father. Turns out, it wasn't a mistake. Linda went pale instantly. Daniel stared between us like he'd suddenly walked into the wrong movie. Richard laughed once, short and controlled. You're making accusations based on grief and gossip. No, I said. I'm making them based on evidence. That word changed the room completely. Evidence, not emotion, not family drama. Evidence? My father's voice dropped lower. You have no idea how defense contracting works. You're right, I said. I only know how the consequences work. A few people quietly stepped farther away from him. That part he noticed immediately. Whitaker finally spoke from across the room. Richard, he said evenly, I strongly suggest you stop talking. The entire room turned toward him. My father stared. Whitaker walked forward slowly. There is an active Department of Defense investigation into procurement irregularities involving Carter Defense Solutions. Nobody breathed. Daniel looked like he might throw up. Richard's face lost color for the first time all night. This is political, he snapped. No, Whitaker replied calmly. This is arithmetic. That line hit hard because everybody in the room understood exactly what he meant. Costs, margins, shortcuts, bodies. Daniel suddenly slammed his glass down. This is insane, he shouted. Then he pointed directly at me. You did this. You've always hated this family. Before anybody could react, he lunged toward me drunkenly. He barely made it 2 steps. 2 federal agents moved instantly from the far side of the room and intercepted him with frightening efficiency. One pinned his arm, while the other guided him backward without unnecessary force. The whole thing lasted maybe 4 seconds, but the humiliation of it, that would last him years. "Let me go!" Daniel yelled. Nobody moved to help him, not even my father. Guests stared silently as the agents escorted Daniel toward the hallway, while he cursed loud enough for the entire house to hear. And that was the moment the Carter family collapsed. Not dramatically, quietly. People started leaving almost immediately afterward. A senator muttered condolences to Linda and exited through the front hall. 2 retired generals avoided shaking my father's hand. One longtime business associate simply grabbed his coat and walked out without saying goodbye. My father stood in the middle of the room, watching his world shrink in real time. Then, finally, he looked at me, eyes cold. "You destroyed this family." I held his stare. For once in my life, I didn't feel intimidated by him at all. "No," I said quietly. "I just stopped protecting it." 3 months later, I was back at Walter Reed on a rainy Tuesday morning, trying to convince a 23-year-old corporal that physical therapy was not a personal attack. "That's easy for you to say, ma'am," he grumbled, while adjusting the brace on his knee. "You're not the one doing squats." "I've had Army physical therapists," I told him. "I survived. Barely." That finally got a laugh out of him. Small victories matter in military hospitals, especially the honest ones. Outside the rehab wing windows, spring rain slid slowly down the glass, while helicopters thumped somewhere in the distance toward Bethesda. The hospital smelled like antiseptic, burnt coffee, and floor wax, like always. Normal life had returned, or at least the version of normal military medicine allows. Most people probably imagined the fallout from my grandfather's funeral turned into some giant dramatic scandal overnight. It didn't. Real life moves slower than television. The investigation into Carter Defense Solutions became public eventually, but in careful pieces. Civil audits, procurement reviews, congressional pressure building quietly behind closed doors. Washington doesn't explode. It corrodes. My father stepped down as CEO 6 weeks after the funeral, officially for health and family reasons. Unofficially, because several longtime partners suddenly discovered urgent reasons not to return his calls anymore. Funny how loyalty works in that town. Daniel checked himself into a rehab program in Maryland after a video from the reception leaked online. Not the confrontation itself, just the aftermath, him screaming while federal agents escorted him through the hallway. For a while, I felt guilty about that. Despite everything, he was still my little brother. Then one night, I remembered all the times he laughed while our father tore me apart growing up. The guilt got quieter after that. Not gone, just quieter. I never spoke publicly about the investigation, never did interviews, never wrote statements. A reporter from the Washington Post called twice, asking if I wanted to comment on military procurement corruption. I didn't call back. I wasn't interested in becoming the face of some scandal. I had surgery scheduled, patients waiting, people who needed me, focused on their future instead of my past. That part surprised some people. One afternoon, Whitaker actually asked me over coffee, "You really don't want revenge?" We were sitting inside a small cafe near the hospital, where half the staff secretly survived on caffeine and bad muffins. I thought about the question for a while before answering. I wanted acknowledgement, I admitted, not destruction. Whitaker nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what I meant. And maybe he did. Powerful men spend their whole lives watching families eat themselves alive over pride. My grandfather's journals arrived 2 weeks after the funeral in 4 old leather boxes delivered directly to my apartment. I waited days before opening them, partly because I was busy, mostly because I was scared. There's something unsettling about hearing the private thoughts of someone who can no longer explain them. The journals covered decades: Vietnam, Pentagon years, political frustrations, army leadership, regrets. So many regrets. The strangest part was realizing how much my grandfather sounded like an ordinary old man when nobody else was around to listen. He wrote about bad knees, terrible coffee, people talking too much in meetings. One entry spent nearly 2 pages complaining about airport security at Reagan National. That one actually made me laugh out loud at midnight, sitting alone on my couch. But every few entries, my name appeared, sometimes only a sentence. Evelyn promoted to major today, saw her photo in Stars and Stripes. Heard from Whitaker she refused evacuation during Kandahar attack. Then later, Richard still thinks influence is the same thing as character. And finally, one night, around 2 a.m, after a 14-hour shift, I found the entry that broke me completely. Richard learned how to impress important men. Evelyn learned how to keep people alive. I should have told her sooner how proud I was. I had to put the journal down after that. Not because I was angry anymore, because grief changes shape. Once you finally receive the thing you spent years pretending you didn't need. A week later, I drove to Arlington before sunrise. The cemetery looked different without crowds. Quiet, honest. Rows of white headstones stretched across the hills under pale morning light, while cold wind moved through the trees. I carried a small bundle of white flowers from a grocery store near Bethesda. Nothing fancy. My grandfather would have hated fancy. I found his grave near the newer section, overlooking the slope toward the Potomac. General Raymond Carter, United States Army, beloved father and grandfather. The words looked strange, carved into stone. For a while, I just stood there, listening to distant traffic from the bridge and the faint sound of birds waking up. Then finally, I crouched down and placed the flowers beside the headstone. "You really made a mess of things," I said softly. That would have made him laugh. I stared at the engraved letters a little longer before speaking again. "I forgive you." The words surprised me once they were out. Not because he deserved complete forgiveness. People are more complicated than that. But carrying anger for years is exhausting work. And somewhere along the way, I got tired of carrying it. I exhaled slowly. I think I finally forgive myself, too. The wind picked up lightly across the cemetery. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was standing there trying to prove something to anyone. Not my father, not my grandfather, not even myself. 3 weeks later, I was waiting to board a military transport flight out of Baltimore for temporary overseas assignment support when a young female medic sitting near the gate kept glancing toward me. Early 20s, maybe. Nervous energy. Finally, she stood and walked over. "Ma'am?" I looked up from my coffee. She pointed toward the last name stitched onto my duffel bag. "Carter, were you in Kandahar in 2018? "Yeah," I said carefully. "Why?" Her expression changed immediately. "My older brother was there." She swallowed hard. "Specialist Ben Keller." The name hit me instantly. Leg injury, massive blood loss, barely survived surgery. "Oh my God," I said quietly. "Ben's your brother?" She nodded. "He still talks about your team." For a second, neither of us said much. Then she straightened slightly without even thinking about it. Not a formal salute, just instinctive military posture. Respect. I smiled a little. How's he doing? Married now, she said proudly. Has a baby girl. That one got me. I looked down at my coffee cup for a second, because sometimes the victories arrive years later, wearing ordinary clothes. Then boarding started. The young medic picked up her backpack. Thank you, ma'am, she said softly. I nodded once. Take care of your people. She smiled and headed toward the gate, and for the first time in years, I watched somebody walk away from me without feeling abandoned. If you've ever chosen your own path, knowing some people might never understand it, then you probably know this feeling already. Sometimes peace doesn't come from winning. Sometimes it comes from finally no longer needing permission to become who you were supposed to be.